My wife and my own father-in-law mocked me in their mother language, a language I didn't understand at the time. I only smiled, nodded, and tried harder to impress them. Later, when I watched the house camera footage, I heard my wife tell her father that I wasn't good-looking, but at least I cleaned up after her. I heard him laugh and say I knew my place. I heard him joke that I was basically a free house cleaner and that she'd made a smart choice marrying me. Everyone laughed. That night, I didn't suspect a thing. Today, she's flooding my inbox with apologies. Before I tell you how everything unraveled and how I ended up seeing my own marriage for what it really was, do me a quick favor, hit subscribe, drop a comment about where you're watching from, and help this story reach the people who might need it. I'm Ethan. I'm 38 years old, and as I sit here replaying the last couple of days in my head, I still feel like I'm watching someone else's life collapse in slow motion. I guess the only way to explain it is to start at the beginning, before I knew what kind of man I had slowly turned myself into without even realizing it. I met Camila at an international night market along the Portland waterfront almost a year ago. It was late summer, warm enough that the air smelled like fried dough and spices, and the place was packed with people wandering from stall to stall. I'd gone with my friend Mark after work, mostly to unwind and complain about deadlines. Camila was working at a booth selling desserts from her home country, something caramelized and flaky that I couldn't pronounce. She had this confident way of moving, fast hands, sharp eyes, and an accent that made everything she said sound intentional. When she handed me my order, she smiled and asked if I liked sweet things. I remember thinking that question alone was enough to hook me. We talked while I waited for my food. She teased me for mispronouncing the name of the dessert, then laughed when I tried again and failed just as badly. Before I left, she slipped an extra pastry into the bag and wrote her number on the receipt. It felt ridiculous and cinematic, like something that didn't happen to guys like me anymore. I texted her that night. She replied almost immediately. From the start, she was magnetic. Attentive. Curious about my life. She asked about my job, my family, what I wanted out of the future. I work in operations coordination at a logistics firm, steady, not glamorous. I've always been honest about that. I didn't grow up with money, and I've been supporting myself since my early 20s. Camila told me she admired that. She said men where she came from didn't always take responsibility the way I did. After a few weeks, she was staying over more often than not. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District, nothing fancy but clean and entirely mine. One weekend turned into 3 nights a week, then 5, and then suddenly she had a toothbrush in my bathroom and clothes in my closet. When I joked about her basically living there, she laughed and kissed me and said it just made sense. At the time, I agreed. We got married quietly about 6 months in. I know how that sounds. Fast. Reckless. But when you're in it, when someone is telling you you're different, that you're safe, that they feel at home with you, logic has a way of softening. She needed stability for immigration paperwork, she said, and I loved her. I told myself that sometimes love is just a leap. The first cracks were so small I dismissed them without effort. She didn't contribute much financially, blaming inconsistent work and paperwork delays. I understood, or at least I wanted to. She started correcting little things about me. The way I laughed was too loud. The way I dressed was too casual. I talked too much at dinner. She framed it as cultural differences, said she was just trying to help me present myself better. I started adjusting without realizing it. Lowering my voice. Choosing my words more carefully. Cooking more often because she preferred things a certain way. Cleaning up before she even asked because it seemed easier than risking criticism. Somewhere along the line, I became proud of how smoothly our home ran, even though I was the one doing most of the work to keep it that way. The night her parents came over was supposed to be a milestone. Roberto and Luciana were visiting from out of town, and Camila made it very clear that this mattered. She gave me instructions all day. Don't joke too much. Don't interrupt. Be respectful. Her father was traditional, she said. Her mother observant. I took the day off work to prepare. I cleaned every surface, cooked multiple dishes, even followed a recipe from Camila's childhood that took hours and left my kitchen looking like a disaster zone. When they arrived, they were polite in the most distant way possible. Smiles without warmth. Nods instead of conversation. Almost immediately, they switched into Portuguese. At first, I assumed it was temporary, just excitement. But minutes turned into hours, and I sat there at my own table, listening to a language I didn't understand while they laughed and gestured and barely acknowledged me. Camila translated occasionally, but vaguely. Family gossip. Old stories. Nothing important. I kept smiling, kept refilling glasses, kept telling myself I was imagining the distance. When I realized I'd forgotten an ingredient for dessert, I offered to run to the store. They barely paused their conversation as I grabbed my keys and left. When I came back, something felt different. The room went quieter. Conversations shifted. I didn't know then that it was because I'd walked back into a room full of people who had just finished tearing me apart. I went to bed that night exhausted, unaware that the truth was already recorded, sitting quietly in my cloud storage, waiting for me to find it. I woke up the next morning with that dull, heavy feeling you get after emotional overexertion, like I'd run a marathon without realizing it. Camila was still asleep beside me, breathing evenly, one arm draped across my chest like everything in our world was perfectly fine. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner in my head, trying to convince myself that the tension I felt had been imaginary. Different cultures. Different habits. That's what I'd been telling myself for months. I slipped out of bed quietly and went into the kitchen to make coffee. As the machine hummed, something clicked in my mind, a memory I hadn't thought about in a long time. Almost 2 years earlier, before Camila ever existed in my life, my apartment had been broken into while I was at work. They'd taken my laptop and a few other things. It rattled me enough that I installed 2 small security cameras, one in the living room angled toward the front door, and another in the hallway that caught part of the kitchen and entryway. They weren't hidden. Anyone who paid attention could see them. Over time, I stopped checking the footage regularly, but they stayed active, quietly uploading everything to the cloud. Standing there with my coffee mug warming my hands, a thought surfaced that made my stomach tighten. I'd left the apartment for nearly 20 minutes the night before. Roberto and Luciana had stayed seated at my table. Talking. Laughing. And Camila, she'd stayed with them. I hesitated. A part of me felt uneasy, like even considering it crossed some invisible line. But then another part of me, the part that had been shrinking for months, reminded me that this was my home. My cameras. My life. I opened the app on my phone and scrolled back to the previous evening. The timestamp lined up perfectly with my trip to the corner store. At first, the footage looked harmless. The 3 of them sitting at the table, plates half empty, glasses in hand. Portuguese filled the room, flowing quickly, animatedly. Even without understanding the words, I could tell the tone had shifted. Roberto leaned back in his chair, smiling broadly. Luciana gestured toward the kitchen, shaking her head with a smirk. Camila laughed in a way I rarely heard directed at me. I muted the video and just watched their expressions. My chest felt tight, like my body already knew something my mind hadn't accepted yet. I couldn't understand the language, but I knew I could find out. I use transcription software occasionally at work, nothing shady, just a professional tool that converts audio to text and translates it. My fingers hovered over the screen before I downloaded the clip. Once it was saved, there was no going back. The upload took less than a minute. The wait afterward felt endless. While the software processed the audio, Camila came into the kitchen, kissed my cheek, and asked if everything was okay. I smiled automatically and said I was just tired. She poured herself coffee like nothing had changed, like the previous night hadn't existed. I wondered, briefly, how long she'd been able to look at me like that while thinking what she thought. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a notification. The transcript was ready. I sat down at the table where I'd served them dinner, the same table I'd polished until it shined, and opened the document. The first few lines were mundane. Comments about the food. About the apartment. Then my eyes landed on a sentence that made my vision blur. He's not very good looking, Camila had said, according to the translation, but at least he cleans up after me. I felt like I'd been punched. Roberto's response came right after. A laugh. Well, he knows his place. Luciana added something about me being useful. About how not all men were, how some needed direction. Then Roberto joked that I was like having a free house cleaner, that Camila had made a smart choice. And Camila laughed. Not nervously. Not awkwardly. She laughed like she agreed. The transcript kept going. Line after line, each one worse than the last. They mocked my appearance. My job. The way I spoke. The fact that I cooked and cleaned. Camila bragged about how easy it was to manage me, how all she had to do was act disappointed and I'd bend over backward to make things right. She said men like me were common here, eager to please, desperate to feel needed. I couldn't bring myself to read everything. My hands were shaking too badly. I dropped the phone on the table and stared at the wall, trying to breathe through the nausea rising in my throat. Every small comment from the past year replayed itself in my mind, suddenly stripped of its excuses. The jokes. The corrections. The guilt trips when I asked for basic fairness. None of it had been accidental. I wasn't her partner. I was a convenience. Behind me, I heard the shower turn on. Camila was humming to herself, completely unaware that her words had just detonated the life we'd built. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, feeling something cold and steady settle in my chest. By the time the bathroom door opened, I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. When the shower shut off, I stood up and moved before I could second-guess myself. That strange calm stayed with me, the kind that settles in after something inside you finally snaps into focus. I walked into the bedroom and pulled 2 large trash bags from the closet. They were the thick kind, the ones I used when I deep cleaned the apartment every few months. Fitting, I thought. I started with her clothes. Not folding, not organizing. Just grabbing armfuls and shoving them into the bags. Dresses, jeans, sweaters, shoes. The closet looked emptier by the second, like the space itself was exhaling. I didn't stop when I found the small box of photos we'd taken over the months, vacation snapshots, selfies from the night market where we met, pictures we'd sent to relatives after the wedding. I tore them in half and dropped them into the bag without looking twice. Camila walked in wearing a robe, her hair still damp, and froze. "What are you doing?" she asked, confusion flickering across her face. I didn't answer right away. I tied the first bag and started on the second. That's when she stepped closer and reached for my arm. I pulled away instinctively, knocking over the lamp beside the bed. It clattered to the floor, the sound sharp and final. I told her I knew. I told her I'd seen the footage. I told her I'd had it translated. I repeated her words back to her, slowly, carefully, making sure she understood exactly which ones had ended us. For a split second, her face went blank. Then she laughed, short and disbelieving, and said I must have misunderstood. That Portuguese jokes didn't translate well. That her parents had a different sense of humor. When I didn't react, her tone shifted. She accused me of spying, of violating her privacy, of recording a private family conversation without consent. I kept packing. That's when she grabbed my forearm, hard enough that her fingers dug in, her nails scraping my skin as she tried to pull me away from the bags. The calm vanished in a flash of adrenaline. I yanked my arm back and shoved her away from me, not hard, but enough to make my point. I told her she had 15 minutes. 15 minutes to get dressed, take what I'd packed, and leave my apartment. She started yelling then, words tumbling out fast and sharp. She called me ungrateful. Dramatic. Said I'd regret this. Said I was nothing without her. The irony almost made me laugh. She told me no one else would put up with me, that I was throwing away the best thing that would ever happen to me. I reminded her, very calmly, that everything she'd been enjoying belonged to me. The apartment. The food. The internet. The stability. I told her she hadn't been my wife, she'd been a dependent who mistook kindness for weakness. That hit a nerve. For a moment, I thought she might actually hit me. Her face flushed, her jaw clenched, and her hands curled into fists. Instead, she grabbed the trash bags, stormed into the bathroom to change, and came back out fully dressed but shaking with rage. As she headed for the door, she kept trying to get the last word in, throwing insults over her shoulder, promising I'd come crawling back. I opened the door and pointed outside. Her final act was to knock over the small table by the entryway, sending my keys and mail skidding across the floor before she slammed the door hard enough to rattle the walls. My neighbor cracked their door open, asking if everything was okay. I nodded and said yes, even though my arm was already bruising where she'd grabbed me. After she was gone, I sat on the living room floor for a long time, staring at nothing. When the shock wore off, something else took its place, relief. Heavy, shaking relief. I cried then, not because I missed her, but because I couldn't believe how close I'd come to losing myself completely. I called my friend Mark and told him everything. He wanted to come over immediately, but I told him I needed an hour alone. I spent that hour gathering the last of her things, stuffing them into another bag by the door. Then I called a locksmith. By early evening, my locks were changed, and the apartment felt mine again for the first time in months. That night, the messages started. Angry at first. Then demanding. Then apologetic. I didn't reply to any of them. Mark came over with takeout and sat with me while I blocked her number, then her social media, then every other way she could reach me. By midnight, the silence felt fragile but real. I went to bed alone, exhausted, staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone I loved could have seen me as something disposable, and how I'd ever allowed it. The quiet didn't last. The next morning, my phone was already lighting up before I'd even finished my coffee. Unknown numbers. Missed calls. Voicemails I didn't listen to. I blocked each one as it came in, telling myself this was normal fallout, that it would fade once she realized I wasn't going to engage. I called in sick to work, blaming a migraine that wasn't entirely a lie. My forearm was sore where she'd grabbed me, the skin yellowing into an ugly bruise that made my stomach twist every time I noticed it. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. Not a casual knock. Persistent. Sharp. I checked the peephole and felt my chest tighten. Camila stood there, hair done, makeup flawless, like she was heading to an interview instead of trying to force her way back into a life she'd torched. She knocked again and called my name, her voice suddenly soft, concerned, like the woman I'd fallen for. I stayed silent. After a few minutes, she left. I sank back onto the couch, my hands shaking, realizing this wasn't over in the neat, contained way I'd hoped. Mark insisted I come stay with him for a few days, and this time I didn't argue. I packed a bag and drove out to Beaverton, checking my mirrors the whole way like I was in some low-budget thriller. Being in his apartment helped, but the unease followed me. Every notification made my pulse jump. Every unfamiliar car outside made me tense. 2 days later, my parents called. They live in Lake Oswego, about 40 minutes from the city, and when my mom asked if I could come by for dinner, her tone was off. No emojis. No jokes. Just, we need to talk. My stomach sank before I even hung up. When I walked into their kitchen, the air felt heavy. My mom sat stiffly at the table. My dad stood at the counter, not turning around right away. That's when they told me Camila had shown up at their house the day before. She'd painted herself as the worried spouse. Said I'd been acting erratically. Claimed I'd become paranoid, that I'd secretly been recording her, that I'd thrown her out in a rage and attacked her. She even showed them a scratch on her arm and implied I'd caused it. Hearing it out loud made me feel like the ground had dropped away. I explained everything. The dinner. The cameras. The translation. The confrontation. My mom listened, her expression cautious but conflicted, until I pulled out my phone and handed it to her. She read the transcript slowly. Carefully. When she finished, her hands were shaking. My dad read it next. He didn't say much. Just nodded once and handed the phone back. Dinner that night was strained. My dad barely spoke, checking the time more than once. Around 7, he stood up, grabbed his keys, and said he needed to step out. I knew immediately where he was going, and panic hit me hard. I tried calling him. No answer. He came back hours later, calm in a way that made me uneasy. He told us he'd waited near a rideshare pickup zone where Camila often worked short gigs. When she finished, he approached her and told her he knew everything. That he'd seen the transcript. That he knew about the lies. He warned her to stay away from me and our family. According to him, she didn't argue. She just went pale. That night, I stayed at my parents' place. My mom suggested I document everything and consider legal options if the behavior continued. I nodded, not fully processing how serious things had become. The next week was quiet. Too quiet. I moved back into my apartment, cleaned obsessively, rearranged furniture, tried to reclaim my space. I started therapy, something I'd avoided for years, and for the first time admitted out loud that I had a pattern of shrinking myself to keep other people comfortable. Then, on an otherwise normal Tuesday at work, everything exploded. I had 3 missed calls from an unknown number and a voicemail that made my blood run cold. It was Camila, her words slurred, switching between English and Portuguese, demanding I talk to her, insisting I owed her a conversation. I deleted it and blocked the number, then warned building security just in case. At 4:30, during a meeting near the front of the office, I saw her. She was at the reception desk, arguing with the younger guard, trying to push past her. My heart slammed into my ribs. I texted Frank, the senior guard, and ducked behind a column, unsure whether to run or confront her. Frank arrived just as Camila raised her voice, insisting she needed 5 minutes with me. When she spotted me standing there with my coworker Jason, something in her snapped. She lunged forward, screaming that I'd ruined her life, that I'd turned everyone against her. People poured out of offices, watching in stunned silence. She cried. She begged. Then she insulted me again, accusing me of betrayal, of already moving on. When Jason stepped in front of me, she swung at him, missing by inches. Security restrained her and escorted her out as she screamed that this wasn't over. My boss told me to go home. Frank walked me to my car. I drove straight to Mark's place, shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. By the time I crawled into bed that night, one thing was painfully clear: the man who'd once smiled and tried to please everyone was gone. And whatever came next, I wasn't facing it alone. The morning after the office incident, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Camila's face in the lobby, rage, desperation, entitlement, all tangled together. My phone buzzed with a message from my boss telling me to take the day off and that HR wanted to meet later in the week to discuss additional security measures. I appreciated the support more than I could put into words. Jason texted too, checking if I was okay. I thanked him and apologized for dragging him into the mess. He brushed it off, saying he'd rather be accidentally involved than stand by while someone crossed a line. That simple loyalty hit me harder than I expected. Later that morning, I finally did what I should have done sooner. I went to the police station and filed a report. I brought everything: the timestamps, screenshots, the translated transcript, photos of the fading bruise on my arm. The officer listened carefully and told me that while Camila hadn't crossed the threshold for an arrest yet, her pattern of behavior was escalating. She helped me start the process for a restraining order and advised me to keep documenting everything. Walking out of that station, I felt strangely lighter. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I'd finally stopped minimizing it. That afternoon, Daniela, Camila's cousin, messaged me again. She apologized, genuinely, and said the family was in chaos. After the scene at my office, Camila had spiraled. She'd been posting angry, cryptic messages online, blaming betrayal, claiming she'd been wronged. Mutual friends sent screenshots without me even asking. According to Daniela, Camila's parents were furious, not at me, but at her. Embarrassment mattered more to them than anything else, and this time she'd gone too far. They'd booked her a one-way ticket back to their home country. The flight was scheduled for the next day. I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction when I read that message. What I felt was relief, cautious and tentative, like easing your weight onto a cracked bridge and hoping it holds. Mark stayed with me that night anyway. We triple-checked the locks, left lights on, and watched some mindless show until my thoughts finally stopped racing long enough for sleep to take over. The next day passed quietly. No calls. No messages. No unexpected knocks. In the evening, Daniela sent one final update: Camila had boarded the plane. She was gone. I sat on my couch for a long time after that, staring at the wall, letting the reality settle in. For months, I'd lived in a constant state of adjustment, measuring my words, my tone, my worth. Somewhere along the way, I'd mistaken endurance for love and self-erasure for compromise. Seeing it clearly now was painful, but it was also freeing. Therapy continued. Some sessions were uncomfortable. Others felt like relief valves releasing pressure I didn't know I'd been carrying. I learned how easily my need to be needed had turned into a liability, how often I'd ignored my own discomfort to keep someone else happy. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about awareness. My apartment feels different now. Lighter. I rearranged the furniture again, brought in plants, opened windows more often. Small things, but they matter. I cook when I want to. I clean for myself. I laugh without checking who might be judging the volume. I don't know what comes next. I'm not rushing into anything. For the first time in a long while, I'm letting my life be quiet. And that quiet feels earned. If you've stuck with me through this whole story, thank you. Truly. If it resonated with you, or if you've ever felt yourself shrinking in a relationship just to keep the peace, you're not alone. Before you go, consider subscribing, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and help this story reach someone who might need the reminder that respect isn't optional, it's essential.